we're going to go a little larger and think about community ecology. So now we're not dealing with just one type of species, but we're looking at multiple species and how they interact with each other and the environment. So first, we're looking at communities and food webs. To define community and describe trophic levels and interactions in a food web. So going back to some of those key ideas, and we looked at this graphic in another lecture, we were looking at population level and organisms, RNK selected species, and then population group. But what we're doing now is looking at this community level. We're going to be talking about food webs, and in the next mini lecture we'll talk about interspecific interactions. And at another point we'll move into ecosystem level. So what is an ecological community? Now, let's take a step back. Pretend I didn't put the word ecological in there. What would you think of as a community? What comes to your mind? Maybe you thought of your community of friends, the community in which you live, right? So it's a group of people, in that case, that are interacting in some way with some commonality, whether you live in the same place, go to the same school, church, sports team, anything. Maybe it's a community of gamers. You play video games and it's your gaming community. So you might not be in the same place, but you have that commonality of gaming. Well, an ecological community is not that different. It's a group of populations of organisms that live in the same place at the same time. So here we're not just talking about one species, like when we talk about human communities. We're looking at groups of different populations of different species. So in these images, we've got a sea otter and some sea urchins, there's kelp. They're all interacting. Sea urchins eat the kelp, which we've talked about before. The sea otters eat the urchins, and they're interacting, living together in the same place and same time. Now, when we talk about these interactions, they can interact through what's called interspecific and intraspecific interactions. Interspecific is between different species, so like the otter and the sea urchins, or the sea urchins and the kelp. Intraspecific is among the same species, so that would be like two otters competing over the same sea urchins, or otters reproducing. That would be intraspecific. So I like to liken it to things that you may have heard of with some of these prefixes. An interstate highway goes between different states, right? The interweb goes between different places all around the world. In fact, an intraweb might just be the server that's at your office or your university. So that's something to think about if you're having trouble remembering these. Species sounds like specific, and then inter is between those different species, like a highway, or among the same species, again, is intra. So these organisms are interacting, and one way they interact is via food webs. So you might have learned this before, and it's probably familiar. It's important to understand, though, because we need to understand the system. We need to understand how these different species interact together, so that when we talk about biodiversity loss or things that we're doing to the ecosystem, we understand how we're affecting a lot of different parts, not just a single organism. So even though this might be a little bit of a refresher, it should help in understanding some of the other issues we'll talk about later. So one of the terms that's helpful to know is a trophic level, and we brought that up in the last lecture. Trophic level is just the level or position you're at in the food web. So this is one trophic level. This is another trophic level. Another. And with them, there's some rules to keep in mind. Producers are, as we talked about, things that are able to take sun energy and convert it or produce that food and heat energy. So grass, phytoplankton, algae. Then the primary consumers, they're things that are going to be consuming, eating something. And primary is that first level. So primary consumers are going to be eating those producers. Then you have secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, and at each level you'd be broken down by detritivores and decomposers. Other terms that you might see: plants, algae, herbivores, maybe another term for that primary consumer. Predators or scavengers might be those higher levels. Now, sometimes people might ask, hey, this rodent here, they would also eat a nut. So are they then a secondary consumer? In that case, they would be a primary consumer if they're eating a nut, because a nut would come from a plant. So places can change depending on what you're eating. So there's a problem with this food web. Can you see what that is? So do grasshoppers only eat grass? Do rodents only eat grasshoppers? We just talked about the rodent eating something like a nut. So this is very simplified. It's good for helping understand connections and relationships, but this is not what a food web looks like in real life. So this is more like what a food web looks like. You don't have to memorize this, of course, but it's just to give an idea that in reality, species don't eat just one food, and they aren't eaten by just one thing. So a food web's a lot more complex than what we saw in the previous slide. So you see here we have turf algae that's being eaten by detritivores, getting eaten by urchins, and those urchins getting eaten by a crown of thorns. Monk seals are eating different types of fish. So that's just something to keep in mind. So let's go back to our simplified food web for a second, just again because it helps us understand these interactions a little clearer. When we look at food web, we've got these different trophic levels. So here are different trophic levels, and they're represented in these images. And energy is going to be lost as it passes from one trophic level to the next. Can you guess how much energy is lost at each level? Well, what we find is that 90% is lost as heat at each level, and only 10% moves on to the next level as food energy. So if this producer has 1,000 units of energy, the grasshopper that eats it is only going to be able to have 10% of that as utilizable energy. The other 90% is lost as heat. So 90% lost as heat, 10% moves up as food energy. Again, remember, it's not destroyed, but it's lost from the, it's not usable by the next level, next trophic level. So what happens is that this leads to less abundance of individuals in populations at higher trophic levels. There's less energy available to support large numbers. A hawk has to eat a lot more in order to survive and get energy, so fewer hawks exist than mice. So what's important to remember, and these bars are showing the relative abundance. Okay, so notice that the bar for the producers is really wide, primary consumers is narrower, the secondary consumer much narrower, and tertiary consumer very narrow, representing less individuals in that group. So because we quickly get to a very small amount of energy once we get to our tertiary consumers. And so remember, though, if we are remembering back to that first simple food web we looked at, and what we talked about is that those tertiary consumers are not just eating a secondary consumer. They might also be eating a primary consumer. So they would get more energy from eating a primary consumer than a secondary consumer. So another term that's good and useful to know is biomass. And biomass is all the biological material that's derived from living or recently living organisms. And the reason we say recently living, it could be the leaves that fell last fall. Those would be part of the biomass. So I used to work in high school teaching biology and ecology, and I would kind of describe it this way. So do you think that there's more elephant biomass, all the species of elephants, or more ant biomass, all the species of ants? Well, this is how you can think about it, because it's dealing with total mass, not just comparing the mass of single individuals to each other. So if you put all the ants in a world in a blender, push start, and you made yourself an ant smoothie, and then you put all the elephants in the world into a blender and made a smoothie, an elephant smoothie, your ant smoothie would be a lot larger because there are more of them. Since there's more ants, even though the mass of an individual ant is a lot smaller than an elephant, when you look at all that biomass, there's more ant biomass than elephant biomass. And so there is more biomass, producer biomass, than tertiary consumer biomass on the planet. So you should now be able to define community and describe trophic levels and interactions in a food web.